Applying for a grant is one thing, getting a grant is something else. And what do you do once you've got a grant? What are your obligations? How do you manage the grant? How do you make sure that the project is going to be delivered on time, on budget, and as per the agreement? My name is Pat Gross of the Community Entrepreneur, and this is the third in a three-part series on the art of grants. In this module, I'm going to use some resources from our Project Management in a Box program. So far we have covered getting ready for a grant and writing a compelling grant application. In this module, the focus will be on managing your funded project. When you find out that your application is successful, your thoughts turn to other things, including what are the contractual requirements and what do the conditions of the grant mean for the project and for our organisation? How are we going to manage this project overall at the highest levels? How are we going to ensure that this is fully supported and it's not likely to fall over simply because the organisation has lost interest at the top? It's about monitoring the budget. How are we going to do that? How are we going to make sure that we stay on plan and make changes to make sure that we still deliver on time, on project, and within the resources that are available? And making sure that we deliver the deliverables. What about the project partners and community stakeholders? The promises and the intent in the application now need to become firm commitment and activity. And of course, what are the risks? What could go wrong? And right now, what could we do to minimise the potential for things to go wrong and the impacts if and when they do? In some cases, even before you apply for the funding, if you look in the information that's supplied up front with the guidelines, application form, FAQs, etc., there may be a sample agreement. And this is there for you to check through, to have a look at the contractual obligations and to see if you can meet them. Because if there's anything there that you can't meet, then there's probably no point in applying for the funding. But if you forget about that and you put your effort into the application, you're successful. This is the kind of information that you should first be looking at when you receive your agreement for signature. Remember, the signature has to be signed at the top level, both by the funder and by your organisation, because it is a legally binding document. And this document will include information such as the agreement period. That's the time frame for the project. Or if it may be a contract, a 3-year contract for recurrent activity, there's different arrangements, but there's always a beginning and an end date. And the key there is to make sure that you do not have activity outside of those dates. If there is activity outside of those dates, then it's ineligible as far as the funding contract is concerned. Then there will be information about the payment terms, how the money is going to be paid, where it's going to be paid. Also, the conditions for triggering the payment. Not all funding is paid up front. Most of the time it's paid in milestones. You may get a percentage up front, which will be paid on agreement, but after that there will be a second level payment which will have some conditions as to the kind of information that needs to be presented and accepted before that next payment period is triggered. So I'll have a look at the payment terms and have a look at them in the context of, is our budget going to be able to stand this, especially if you get later into the project and the funding starts to trickle at the beginning. You will be able to pay your staff, etc. But then sometimes there comes those milestone payment periods where you might find that your budget is getting very tight and you may have a cash flow issue. So just make sure that the payment terms and the trigger payments actually meet well with your budget. Another area is the conduct of the project, how the funds have got to be used. the conditions for use, how the project will be managed, the reporting dates, rules around subcontracting, and roles and responsibilities. A lot of this will come from the application itself. There could be a schedule there about the project plan, and what it's going to be used for. As I said, there will be reporting dates, which will then trigger the payments. If you're thinking of subcontracting, make sure by checking the agreement that this is allowed, because sometimes the funder does not allow subcontracting. If you're putting in an application at the start and you're going to have project partners, or you're going to be subcontracting to some of the activity, then that should be in the initial application. And then the funder may or may not agree to that, depends on the conditions of the application process. But if they do agree to that at the beginning, then that's fine. But if you're putting an application in and then afterwards, when you've got the funding, you decide to subcontract the activity, you may be in breach of the contract. So double check whether you are allowed to subcontract. And then there'll be the roles and responsibilities of the funder and the contractee, which is your organisation, which is standard for any agreement. Who will be responsible for what, etc. How funds are to be managed, and there may be conditions around how your funds should be managed, and that should be something that's stated and clarified in the agreement, so check that every time. Record keeping. You may find that you are required to keep copies of your records for anything up to 7 years. This is just as an example. It could be longer, it could be shorter, depending on what your application is about. Certain records in the education and training field need to be kept for 2 years. Finance, 7 years plus. So there'll be conditions about how you should, the kind of information you should be keeping and how long you should be keeping it for. So that has implications for your storage, how that information is going to be stored. And that also to make sure that, like in the olden days, if it was paper storage, then one of the things you had to be very, very mindful of is what would happen if there was a fire or another natural disaster, shall we say. But today it's about the integrity of the records. If you're keeping them online, making sure that they're kept safe, the privacy, and that they're to be accessible. And of course the currency of the software that you're using to store the information, especially if you've got to store the information for a period of time. So there are implications there about how long you should be keeping your records for, what kind of records you should be keeping, and in terms of privacy and integrity. As with most arrangements when it comes to contracting or tenders, as an example, this is a grant, there is a requirement by the funder, or a sort of ability by the funder to actually be able to audit the organisation that's being contracted. And you may find there are conditions there where the funder will deem that they will have access to the premises and materials to ensure the quality of the process, to check for fraud. It's not necessarily to go check for fraud. It may be a standard requirement that the funder would be, it's their condition that they would come in and have the right to audit the materials in relation to the agreement. Nothing outside of that. It's about the contract. It's standard quality assurance process, but be mindful that that's a condition that you are signing to. Then there's intellectual property, and who owns the IP? There's different scenarios. There's the IP that's being developed during the course of the agreement. Who owns that? And then there's IP that's probably comes from outside of the agreement. So there's different conditions in terms of intellectual property. So the agreement should be very clear about how you determine who owns the intellectual property. Attached to that may be the fact that there might have been some equipment or some capital infrastructure or something like that. And sometimes there might be a question mark about who owns the equipment. So have a look at that. Most times now the equipment is just directly delegated as a cost, and it's owned by the contractor, the organisation. But in the past, there have been episodes where the equipment has actually belonged to the funder for a period of time. Just the funny way that some of the funding has been allocated. So just make sure as well that the equipment is your equipment when you buy it. Acknowledgement and publications. This is about the fact that the funder does want the world to know that they have contributed towards the cost of the project. So you will be required to acknowledge their funding, and there will be conditions about how this knowledge, how this acknowledgement should be displayed to the world. It will be around the kind of the language, the text, the images, and then that will go down as far as the fonts and the colours, just to be sort of in line with their corporate identity. And the same applies to publications, how you promote them in your, it could be your promotional literature, or it could be course brochures, and at the back of them you may well have an acknowledgement of with the logos of the different benefactors or donors or funders. So there will be conditions about how you use their information. As with other contracting arrangements, there will be information about disputes, negation, suspension, termination, and repayment of funds. Now, it's important that you read that and understand that, because it's also around if you're not happy, how can you address issues. It's a formal process that you would go through, and the funder will be required to go through that formal process. They can't just decide to say, that's it, we're going to suspend funding, there is actually a process. So look at that and those conditions, and make sure that you are able to meet those conditions. It's the same with from your perspective as an organisation. You may decide that you no longer want to continue. So again, have a look at the termination clause, etc. Repayment of funds. Now, one thing here is, if you think you're going to hit some problems and you're not going to spend the money, let the funder know sooner rather than later. To be fair to everybody in the ecosystem, especially if your funding is triggered by milestones, if you get to a certain milestone and you know that you're not going to use the rest of the funding, and it does happen, you alert the funder, who still has time to reallocate that funding. But if you take all the funding and get to the end and you haven't spent it, and there may be different reasons, and you may need to repay those funds, first of all, the funder probably doesn't want to be in that situation in the first place, and secondly, when those funds are repaid, there's every possibility that the funding cannot be reallocated because it may be too late, and the funding may not go back to the bucket of funding that it came from in the first place. It may go into overall capital, so everybody loses that way. So it's important to have a look and keep checking your budget, and if you think there's going to be a problem in terms of you're not able to spend what you've applied for, let the funder know sooner. There'll be a section around insurances and what kind of insurances are required. Public liability, indemnity, building insurance. There's lots of insurances that can be chosen from. And also there will be a clause there that will say that your organisation indemnifies their organisation. So make sure that you've got that indemnity clause and that you can meet it, and just in case there is a problem, so you're protecting their interests. And also protection of information and conflict of interest. Protection of information, of course, it's the information that's been produced during this project, and how it's going to be used. If it's like if it's business information which is quite sensitive, how that information is going to be maintained just between the funder and the contractee. It could be protection of information in relation to privacy. Privacy of benefactors, etc. Not benefactors, beneficiaries. Privacy of beneficiaries. It could also be privacy of benefactors if somebody doesn't want to share their names being put out in the public domain. And there's also conflict of interest. What happens if there's going to be a conflict of interest? So have a look at the funding agreement, go through the conditions, and just double check that you are able to meet those conditions. When you start a project, just make sure that you've got the governance arrangements in place. And what we mean there is it starts with the contract and it starts with the funder. And especially if you've got partner organisations involved here. This is the way that how you could organise the governance of your project in two parts. First of all, if it's just your organisation, you would have a governance subcommittee, because the committee or the board is responsible for the overview of the organisation, ensuring the strategic direction is met. Regarding to project funding, their responsibility is to make sure that the contractual arrangements are met. In other words, as per the previous slide, including things like they're going to achieve the milestones, the payment dates, that we're going to spend the money as per the agreement, that you may have an evaluation framework in place. And there's the appointment of the senior staff on the project. So there's a high level of monitoring that's concerned. Now, you really don't want the committee or board to be spending all their time doing that. So you probably would appoint a subcommittee of about 2 or 3 of the committee members, at least one officer. It could be the treasurer, it could be the secretary. Treasurer maybe, because there's the obligation there to make sure that the finances are being spent appropriately. If it's a small funded project, then maybe this is something that can be just handled at the high level. But if it's a larger project, then you'll have a subcommittee, because there may be how do we look at human resources, and how are we managing that, the finances, etc. So you'll be looking at picking the subcommittee and the skills relating to some degree as how they could be supporting the overall direction of the project. And then the subcommittee will be referring to a project manager. The project manager will be taking information. Now then, there could be a step between the subcommittee and the project manager, and that might be the CEO, the Chief Executive Officer, and the project manager may be reporting to them. But if it's a small organisation, it might just go straight to a subcommittee. It depends on your structure. But the key is that anybody below the project manager should not be talking to the subcommittee or above. If there's an issue, there should be a policy and a process in place for policies and process in terms of dispute, or how do you address problems. But the project manager then is responsible for the project team, and the project team members report to the project manager. The reason why I'm sort of talking about not going straight to the committee level is because I have seen examples when people have taken that initiative because they haven't been happy about how they think the project's being managed and gone straight to the higher level, and the higher level's got involved, and the question is nope, or should they have been involved, and the answer is definitely no. Now this structure here on the slide is if you've got a second organisation or a third organisation, or if you have project partners, and therefore the structure is slightly different because the funder contracts with one organisation only, and that's the lead organisation, and that lead organisation is totally responsible for the conditions of the agreement. So they would have a subcommittee at that level, and that subcommittee will have a little bit of a different relationship to if it was just a straightforward project in their own organisation, because they'll be aware of the partner organisations involved. Now the partner organisation will probably get involved at the steering group level, which is below the subcommittee. The subcommittee can really focus on how this contract is moving and in terms of how it impacts on the organisation, and then they report up to the board, committee of management, etc., with a summary of what's happening. The project steering group is slightly below because that can bring in the partner organisation, and that is more to do with the governance of the project in relation to its activities and what they're going to do, and how it works across different, with different partners. So project steering group will have the ability to make decisions that must be if there's an impact on the organisation itself, the lead organisation, those decisions must be ratified by the committee at the highest level. They can't just make decisions in a steering group and then the organisation goes by what's said. They still have to go to the top level to make sure everybody agrees. But there is a level of authority within a project steering group in terms of as far as possible where it doesn't impact on the organisation but it has benefit to the project itself. And then the project manager would report to the project steering group as opposed to the subcommittee. And again, there may be an executive officer somewhere there. Now, for the operation of the project, it's really good to get input from the community or from the marketplace of businesses of interest. So you would have a project reference group. And that's what it is. It is a reference group. It doesn't steer the project, doesn't have any authority on how the project is moulded. It's basically there to provide reference, to provide input, and it goes both ways because the project can be putting that information out, their progress to the community, but at the same time the community, and I say community or market, whoever your interest group is, will be providing some intelligence into the project and influence how it works on a day-to-day level. And then in that reference group, the project manager will then the project team will report again to the project manager. Sometimes when people are visual, it's always good to be able to articulate where people sit in an organisation structure. So it's always advisable to create an organisation chart in the operational level with the project manager. There could even be a link there to the CEO, but underneath the project manager there's going to be an admin assistant. There always is somewhere along the line, and then there's going to be a number of technical roles, and they probably sit aside each other, and it's good to see that visually because then you can see that nobody has got authority over somebody else at that same level. Good communication is vital when it comes to a good project plan. And there are various ways that you can communicate within a project. Now, talking at the governance channels here, we've covered those in terms of reporting structures. That there is the steering group, there's a subcommittee. This information may be flowed up through a formal process, reported to the full board or committee once a month via a report that may start with the project manager and go up through the system until it's formally presented to the project to the board. But the information that's supplied at the board level is to be relevant to how it impacts in terms of the conditions of the agreement. What progress, how much has been spent to date, all those accountability checks that gives the board committee a good picture of exactly where they're at and where the risks are likely to be. In the governance channels, there's also in relation to working with partners. And the one thing you have to do, and I've seen this being a failure in some project activities, is ensure there is good communication between the project partners. There's the communication at the project manager level and the steering group, and sometimes you're so busy doing the doing that you're not really communicating with your partners. And I've seen so many partners walk away disheartened because they feel like the project is just being done by this organisation for this organisation's benefit, when really it's down to just poor communication. So that comes to team accountability as well, in terms of being accountable for what you're doing. How do you report what you're doing and how that fits into the overall project management structure? There's audience-focused communication. What is the information with the communication that you want to present to the various stakeholders internally and externally? Then there are your internal reporting structures, and we're going to have a look at that on the next slide. And policies and procedures. Make sure that you've got some really good policies and procedures around communication. And it's not just communication itself, it's things that could happen like grievance, which I've just mentioned previously. What happens if internally you're not happy with the way the project's going forward, or happy with one of your team members? There is a number of things that that could go wrong, and make sure that your policies and procedures are in place and that everybody is aware of and can read those policies and procedures and feel safe enough to be able to act on them to get a mutually agreed results. Now, the internal reporting structure is so important, especially when you have a large complex project. And here this plan is just simple. It's what needs to be reported, when, what are the regular intervals, or it could be by exception if there's a problem, how it could be reported. It could be a formal template, a formal process. Some information may just be available to be passed on by email, but you may have who. That's who it should be presented to. There's a by who is responsible for those reports. It could be project progress reports. Who is responsible for putting those reports together, and who are the recipients of those reports? And any comments, if you're going to be doing these, there might be some special quirks or conditions. So have a look at the beginning of your project and think about, when it comes to communication, when it comes to reporting the progress, what What information is being held or could be held by the team members, and which of that information then needs reporting into the structure, so that you're capturing the right information that will then contribute to the overall project reporting process. One way that you might organise your communication is by putting together an internal-external communication plan. And this is to plan how you will communicate with the stakeholders inside your organisation, which may mean other departments or higher in the hierarchy. And it could mean external communication, which means stakeholders outside. It could mean the community, the people that you're trying to maintain regular contact with. So this plan template here is designed for you to determine who your audience is, what kind of message that you're wanting to get across, how you will deliver that message, whether it's going to be on social media, whether it's going to be email, maybe there's some internal communication, internal sort of app infrastructure, the frequency of the information, because consistency is always a good way to move forward. It certainly builds that know, like and trust of the people that you're trying to communicate with, and who in your team is going to own and be responsible for this communication. Good project management is about monitoring the budget, project plan and deliverables. When you're at the start of the project, consider the success factors. This is what I call the golden triangle. And this is your ability to deliver the project on budget, on time, and on specification. And central to this are your resources, the people involved. And what you need to consider is what could go wrong with each of those three goals. What could affect the budget so that you may end up with an overspend or an underspend? What about the time? What could go wrong there? And what could impact on your ability to deliver what you said you would deliver? Consider these, and also the tensions that may be that the budget, if you're going to go over budget, may have an impact on what you're going to deliver, the quality of what you're going to deliver, and the time frame. So think about all of these three factors and how you can move them and squeeze them so that you can compensate for each other, but at the same time bring them all back into shape, so by the end of the project you can deliver on budget, you can deliver on time, and you can deliver what you said you would deliver at the specification that you said you would deliver at. At the beginning, think about how you're going to monitor the project. For instance, how you're going to monitor the finances and the resources. These are the inputs. You have to get the inputs right in order to be able to deliver the processes. How are you going to monitor the processes? How are you going to measure? How are you going to ensure that you're going to deliver the quality, on budget and on time? Consider the reporting arrangements and consider the outputs, the milestones that you'll be able to trigger a warning if things are not going to plan. Or if things are going ahead of plan, of course, is the other side as well. And how are you going to monitor the results? This is an example of a work breakdown structure, and if you certainly didn't go into detail when you designed the application and the project plan at that stage, have a go now or revisit your project plan and break it down into more detail. So even with this plan, which is a top level in many ways, take those activities and break them down further, so you've got a clear indication and to be able to estimate the human resources, the time it takes and the budget, and involve your team and other people such as project partners in this exercise, because it's so easy to be tunnel visioned and forget the intricacies of being able to put together a plan that considers all the elements concerned. As you're putting together your detailed plan, you'll be able to ascertain some milestones. So plan those milestones and put them onto a template such as this one. So what those milestones will be, when you schedule them to be have been completed, and then as you're going through the project, actually when they were completed, so you can see the variance in time and what that variance has on your project timeline. And that variance may have implications for your project budget as well. When it comes to managing project partners and community stakeholders, what should you be planning? What should you be thinking about? Well, first of all, there's inclusivity to the extent of delegation. And what I mean there is for what purpose? So if you've got partners, to what degree are the partners involved? And within those partners, there could be the highest level and there could be the operational level. So you might, for instance, at the governance level, at the steering group level, you may have the representatives of the board of each of the partners involved to add value to the governance of the overall project, and that happens in the steering group as well. It could be that there would be project staff that might be shared between the two organisations, and again, how would they be accountable to the project? How would a staff member from one organisation be reporting to a project manager from another? Interesting concept. Same with reference groups. I've mentioned this before to some degrees. To what level do they have authority? Well, they don't. Their authority is knowledge and being able to impart information that will benefit the project, and also to receive information that will benefit the recipients of the project. It's a reference group. That's all it is. That's the extent of its delegation. Ensure that there is a partnership agreement for formal joint ventures. To ensure in that partnership agreement there's a communication, there's all those contractual arrangements that you would find in a formal agreement with your funder, but in the context of how you would work that as a partnership. It could be an informal memorandum of understanding, or it could be a full-blown agreement. Normally when it comes to sort of community projects, for example, it probably is limited to a memorandum of understanding of what people's obligations are and how they will participate. We've mentioned steering groups, we've mentioned reference groups. Make sure that you've got terms of reference in place and that they're signed, so that people who are members of those groups understand their level of delegation, their purpose, what they're there for, how regular they will be attending meetings, whether they could have people to substitute for them if they're not able to attend, what level of authority they've got to be able to participate or to make decisions, how that works within their own organisation, how that works in the context of the project, their roles and responsibilities within the terms of reference for those particular the steering groups, reference groups, whatever groups you're putting together, the commitment and expectations. And again, as I said, make sure that they're signed, because that's a good indication that these people have been made aware of and agree to the conditions of participating. Now, when you're going into a project, there is going to be some risks, and here are some examples of risks to be considering when you're in a project management situation. For instance, what happens is there's some conflict. How do you prevent or mitigate the impact of conflict? And depending on your project, you will be able to come up with some scenarios of potential conflict and what you would do. What would you do now? You may have a grievance policy that everybody signs, a grievance process. It could be, steps to reconcile issues. There's a few things that you could do to resolve conflict. It could be organisational conflicts, and there may be some things that are triggered in the agreements. Lack of accountability, and that's usually if it's like there's no real commitment. There's no, for instance, partners in a project. They haven't sort of been signed up to some letter of, it's like a letter of intent. It's not been their top priority. So there's different things. There's different circumstances where you find that the people are not being held accountable for their activities. So it's important in your project plan to have some position statements, and within those position statements, roles, responsibilities, and some accountability measures. So make sure that people are very clear what the roles are and how they contribute to the overall project. Another risk is having too many cooks. There's too many bosses, there's too many people with their ideas, and it becomes a bit of a mishmash. That's why it's very clear to have an organisation structure in place with very clear reporting channels and some scenarios on situations and how you should respond to those situations, and to show also that there is clear delineation between roles, and that would come up in the position descriptions, and again the levels of authority. So make it clear that when it comes to too many cooks, that actually the cooks understand who the chef is. So make it very clear, and have an organisation plan in place, an organisation chart that people can relate to. Project manager leaves. This is probably one that you should put at the top of every risk plan, because that can happen and does happen. So because you tend to put a lot of trust and a lot of accountability on the project manager, when they leave, and especially if you've left everything to their devices, and you find that you've no idea exactly where you are in the project. So it's important there to have reporting structures in place on a regular basis. Maybe there's a mentor from the board who's working alongside the project manager every so often, so that they're kept up to date. There's regular reports that go into that put into the system, and there is a few things you can actually do to be kept up to date without micromanaging the project manager. That is not allowed. You do not micromanage a project manager, but you do have and are entitled to have a reporting system, whether it could be a computer system where reports are kept and you can see those reports, especially when it comes to in terms of completion of milestones, expenditure costs, people, resources. If you've got some really good project management software, that's great, you can do that, and as long as that system's kept up to date, it minimises the impact. If a project manager does leave, you know exactly where everything is in respect to the progress of the project. Lack of communication, that's a biggie. I gave an example earlier about project partners working together, and you find that one organisation's taking the lead and they take the responsibility, and they forget to tell the partners exactly what's doing, why decisions are made, because there's been no planning on how decisions are made. Significant decisions this is, and you find a project manager may be aligned to one organisation, and therefore their priorities rest with that organisation and not with the project. and you find then that there's some unsettlement, and partners become disgruntled. And that's one example of lack of communication. Lack of communication can happen in many ways. It can happen between the project manager and the board because they're not informing them, they're not keeping them up to date. Or it could be quite simply the board's sort of heavily reliant on the project manager and just says go away and do it. And then they don't know until something drastic happens, and then hey, there's been no communication. Poor project management skills. Yes, this is especially when you've got a volunteer situation. Make sure that your project manager has got the right skills, got the right experience of similar kinds of projects. When it comes to writing your funding application, it's very important that you actually articulate the kind of skills and experience that you expect your project manager to have. So when it comes to running the project, that's exactly what you should have. You might find that the funding body appears to be too hands-on. They're wanting too many reports. They're wanting to keep on top of you. And it may be perceived or it may be real. Now, you are accountable when it comes to a contract and the milestones and the red tape. As we said, when you go into an agreement, those are the conditions of the agreement. And therefore you have no choice but to stand by those conditions. And it may seem that there's too much red tape. It may seem that you've got to do too much report writing, but remember that they are accountable as well. And it's the same scenario as the project manager. They need to be kept up to date on a regular basis that their funding is being spent in the way that it's meant to be spent. But sometimes, yes, you do, especially if the funder thinks that there's something not quite right, you're not achieving what you need to be achieving, then there will be a little bit more frequent trying to keep up with what you're doing, and trying to get information from you. Or it could be simply that you are doing so well that they need you as an example, so they come back to you and be asking questions. And sometimes that can feel as if they're being a little bit too hands-on as well. So there's many reasons, but more often than not, it's accountability. They're accountable. The contract makes you accountable to them, and there's no way to avoid it. You do have to supply the information. It's great doing the project, but the paperwork is still necessary. And then the other is budget, overspend or underspend. What are the risks of that happening? Usually for a infrastructure project, you could build in contingencies, and you could say that we've got a 15% contingency because the price of materials may go up in the time it takes to put the application together and get funded. That's a classic one when it comes to construction, especially at the moment with the increasing costs of construction materials. And usually there could be delays, which means those costs are even higher. So how do you account for that? And also, if you haven't overspent, you may be looking at, well, how do you cut back the resources, the people time, and materials, but not in such a way as to reduce the quality. You may just need to go and look around for alternate quotes that may come in cheaper, but not compromising the quality. And if you've got an underspend, again, plan for at what point will you trigger a warning to the funder, and the funder may come up with some advice on how you may spend the funding, or how you may not draw down the next tranche of funding, or under extreme circumstances, how you would need to pay back those underspent funds. And a final risk is future sustainability. How are you going to sustain the impact of what you've already achieved in this project. Too often we've got a great idea, we run with the idea as a project, and then when the funding stops, everything that's been achieved comes to a full stop. So what you might consider is, as part of the project, and even consider this at the application stage, is what assets can be developed as part of the project that you can then later monetize. So you might come up with a manual or a process, a system. It could be some physical assets, but it could be something that would be developed as a part of the project that you can take forward, a user guide, the guide to this. Or there's something you can develop. If there is, then consider it. It's a legacy of the project, and at the same time it will help to keep the essence of the project going into the future. You could consider what partnerships could we develop for future collaboration. As you're going through the project, you might come up with ideas, new ideas, or the next step. Or there could be interest here from other organisations in your project. I'll give you an example. I call this the $1 million project because it started off as a small funded project which snowballed, and every time it came to applying for the next tranche of funding, because there was a slight change or there was some learnings from that project, that then created a new project, and that snowballed until the last iteration, which was over 2 million. But it was interesting that at one point, when a 3-year funding stopped, a community organisation came forward and said, we will fund you now for the next 18 months. So that actually helped them in the gap of the cycle of the funding that they were getting, and it took it to the next level. And then from there they did a leapfrog with another community partner, and to again pick up on a development that had been evolving as the projects were evolving, to attract a large multi-million-dollar project. So, and the other, again, this is an example of learning from the messages of the results and then packaging those results into another program. So in this module we've covered the contractual requirements and what the conditions of a grant will mean to you, project governance, and how at the top level of the organisation this will work. We talked about monitoring the budget, the project plan and the deliverables, the golden triangle, managing project partners and community stakeholders, and preventing or mitigating risks. We trust that you enjoyed the Art of Grants. My name is Pat Gross, the Community Entrepreneur. If you want to find out more about our programs and how we can meet your needs, go to getthatgrant.com. Thank you. And good luck with your grant endeavours.